saved. And one of the things that went wrong is when we let Lehman Brothers go, it caused us enormous trauma. And that's increased the fear about, but that's an example of doing things wrong. We didn't ask the question. There was a systemically important part of Lehman Brothers.
Which was?
Which were the commercial paper that was part of the money market funds that people were using like banks. That's part of our basic payment mechanism. We could have saved that part and let the gambling part of Lehman Brothers, which is not part of the payment mechanism, go down. And because we took this blunt approach, we failed. And what the financial markets are doing is saying you have to save everything if you're going to save anything. And that's just wrong.
Tomorrow, President Obama is going to announce plans to cut the deficit in half. Do you think that's the right way to go?
What we have to remember is we are in for most likely a long and extended downturn. We will eventually recover. That's not a question. But in 2011, 2012, will we be in a sharp recovery or in a more slow recovery? One of the lessons from Japan was that in 1997, when they were in the beginning of their recovery, they increased taxes because they wanted to get rid of their deficit, and the economy sank down back into a downturn. The way to look at it is the following. Right now, in 2009, 2010, we're talking about per year something like a stimulus bill of $350 billion per year. To cut the deficit in half, with the deficit as we go into, without the stimulus, is $1.5 trillion. So you're talking about pulling out $750 billion. That's a reversal in expenditure, taking out the stimulus and cutting back expenditures by another $600 billion. We're talking about a turnaround of $1 trillion. Do you really believe that by 2011, 2012, our economic recovery will be so strong that it can withstand that kind of taking out of expenditure? I don't think so. And so if you went ahead and did that, we would go back into a downturn.
Joe Stiglitz, you co-wrote The $3 Trillion War, The True Costs of the Iraq Conflict. Talk about the effect of war on the economic crisis. And now we're not only talking about Iraq, but your thoughts on increasing the number of troops, intensifying the war in Afghanistan.
Well, first let me say, the president did have two things that I really welcome, and several of the suggestions that we made in our book, he has adopted. For instance, in the past, under the Bush administration, the war was totally funded by, or almost totally funded by emergency appropriations. It was as if every year was a surprise. And he said he's going to put that on the books so that we can evaluate it, make sure their money is going in the best possible way. The second thing that in our book that was, really I found very moving was the way we treat our veterans is terrible. And he said, they fought for us. We have to fully fund the Veterans Administration. So those were really important moves in the right direction. But on the other side, the move into Afghanistan is going to be very expensive. Things are not going very well. Our European those who are NATO partners are getting disillusioned with the war. I talked to a lot of the people in Europe, and they really feel this is a quagmire. We're going into another quagmire. And one of the things that we do talk about in our book is that if you keep a residual force in Iraq, it's going to be very expensive. That's the experience that Britain has had. They've kept relatively few troops, and the result of that is the savings that they had hoped weren't materialized. And so that goes back to the part that he talked about at the end of his speech, the deficit. If you're going to be spending all this money in Afghanistan and in Iraq, that deficit is just going to be that much greater.
So you think Obama is wrong on Afghanistan?
I think so.
Have you told him? Have you been talking to him?
Not on that issue.
You've been talking to him, though?
During the primary, in the period afterwards, and some discussions about what to do with the banks, there were discussions. Meaning
you talked to him on the telephone?
Yeah.
I wanted to get your response. After President Obama spoke, the Louisiana governor, Bobby Jindal, gave the Republican Party's official response. He blasted President Obama's stimulus bill as an irresponsible piece of legislation.
Democratic leaders in Washington, they place their hope in the federal government. We place our hope in you, the American people. In the end, it comes down to an honest and fundamental disagreement about the proper role of government. We oppose the national democratic view that says the way to strengthen our country is to increase dependence on government. We believe the way to strengthen our country is to restrain spending in Washington, to empower individuals and small businesses to grow our economy and to create jobs.
Louisiana Governor Jindal, your response, Joe Stiglitz.
I wish he'd taken an economics course. The fact is that when the economy is weak as it is, you need to stimulate aggregate demand. If you don't do that, the economy gets weaker. And what's good about most of Obama's plan is that it's creating assets. So while the liabilities go up, we're going to have to borrow. We also are creating assets. If we had spent a few $1 billion under the beginning of the Bush administration and the levees in New Orleans, we would not have had to spend so much money in the cleanup, in dealing with the devastation that it brought. That would have been money that would have had an enormous return. $5 billion would have saved $150 billion. And so that's an example where there are certain kinds of investments in technology, investments in people, that the private sector can't do, and the government can do in ways that give us a very high return.
Joe Stiglitz, very briefly, the whole issue of globalization. We're in the 10th anniversary of the mass protests in Seattle, the Battle of Seattle. What about the questions raised in corporate-led globalization?
Well, I think two very important issues. One of them is the model that was behind much of the impetus for that globalization was a model based on free, unfettered markets. And we know that model, deregulation, has failed. That was the kind of thinking that led into the problems that the United States is in today. The second point is that while we talk about free and open markets, what the United States has been doing has destroyed a level playing field and will have profound implications for the evolution of globalization going forward.
And for developing countries? And
for developing countries, it's having a devastating effect. I mean, just a couple of days ago, the other American banks were complaining about the huge subsidies we're giving to Citibank. They say, how can we compete when the government is subsidizing Citibank to that extent? Now, if you think these other American banks that have gotten massive subsidies are complaining, you can imagine the kind of feelings that people have in developing countries that say, we can't afford those mega subsidies. How can we compete against the Washington being able to write a check anytime anything goes wrong?
And health care, he's called for universal health care, but he does not call for single-payer health care.
I think that there are some fundamental problems in the efficiency of our healthcare system. And what we've seen is that the private healthcare insurers do not know how to deliver an efficient way.
Do you support single-payer health care?
I think I've reluctantly come to the view that it's the only alternative. You know, we've tried a lot of other things, and we've been, you know, I was in the Clinton administration, and we debated a lot of alternatives, and I've watched things as they've emerged and, you know, evolved over the last 16 years. And I think there's a growing consensus that the private market solution is not going to work.
Joe Stiglitz, I want to thank you for being with us, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, professor at Columbia University, co-author of The $3 Trillion War, The True Cost of the Iraq Conflict. When we come back, we'll be joined by the former chair of the UN Human Rights Commission, former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson. Stay with us.
For a long time, I said to run on for a long time, and you can run on for a long time. And let me tell you, God Almighty gonna cut you down. So go tell that long-told liar, go tell that midnight rider, tell that gambler, rambler, backbiter, tell them God Almighty gonna cut you down. A cigarette, God Almighty, let me tell you the news. My head been wet with the midnight dews. I've been down on my bending knees, talking to the man from Galilee. Well, my God spoke so sweet that I thought I heard the shuffle of an angel's feet. And put